Broadcasting from Orchard Park, New York,
and Boca Raton, Florida,
it's the Freight 360 podcast. From freight broker sales tips to sports talk, this podcast is all about helping you grow as a freight broker. We're your hosts, Nate Cross
and Benjamin Kowalski.
Let's talk freight. Welcome back for another episode of the Freight 360 podcast. We're up to 258 this week. And we're going to be doing a little bit of a one-on-one style episode for anyone newer to the industry, or just a more broad discussion on supply chain, since we're normally very niche focused on brokerage. But if you are brand new, make sure to check out all of our other content. You can go to freight360.net to see all of our blogs, our videos, our downloadable content. And while you're there, check out the Freight Broker Basics course if you're looking for educational option. And leave us a comment. You can do it on YouTube, leave us a review on your podcast platform, share it with your friends, and that helps us continue to grow this channel organically. Ben, how's it going in Florida today?
Weather's nice. That's about all I can say about Florida. As it relates to how everything's been going, it's just what I was telling you right before we jumped on the air. Had a double brokered load, working through some scenarios with a client of ours, and yeah, just part of the business.
Nice. Yeah, we'll unpack your double broker story in just a minute here, because I think that's it's good learning for folks out there. We've had kind of a cold week in Buffalo, man. It's like been in the 50s. It feels like fall. But it's supposed to warm up, and we'll see how that pans out.
But that's super nice, right? Football, I feel like when the seasons change around preseason, to me, living up north, that's like my favorite time of year. But again, I have like a birthday in the fall and loved Halloween. So like fall and winter, like some of my favorite holidays.
Yeah, for sure. I love fall. But we only get, whoa, my camera just went nuts there on me.
It did. You got it on follow. So you got to hit that little button.
I'll get it fixed. Anyway, our when in Buffalo here, we only have so much, summer warm weather and all that. So it's definitely a little bit depressing when the weather starts to cool off. And it's just a cold front that came through, so nothing too crazy. But it is what it is. I was golfing on Monday for my men's golf league, and it was like raining the whole time, and like you had to wear long sleeves. It was just for like the middle of August, just kind of like ick, you know what I mean? But
again,
anyway,
I am super excited for fall. We didn't have a cold spell, but we had a humidity reprieve, I would call it, where the humidity went from like 98, which basically it stays at for 3 months, to like normal. And it felt like, I was like, oh, it's like in the 70s. I looked at my phone. I was like, oh, it's still 89, but just noticeably not sticky, where I didn't feel like I needed to change my shirt just walking out to the mailbox. So welcome change.
Fair enough. Well, I'm taking my car in to get the AC fixed finally today, even though it's like cold. So that's like the irony of all of this. But anyway, it is what it is. Sports, real quick. The preseason football continues on. The Bills and Steelers faced off last weekend on Saturday night. I don't think there was a single touchdown. I think the final score was 9-3, if I remember correctly. But the Bills did take a win. Russell Wilson. I don't know. Did you watch the game at all?
I couldn't, and that was super. I was really looking forward to it. Set a reminder on my phone, and then the Dolphins preseason game was aired.
Yeah,
and I don't have my TVs. Like, they're getting set up Friday with cable and everything. I'm going to get the NFL package this year, but I just completely forgot that I didn't do it. And then I was like, for some reason, expecting to be able to watch it, even though I haven't been able to watch preseason games in 10 years. You'd think I'd remember.
Yeah, so I mean, like Russell Wilson started for Pittsburgh, and he got sacked twice by Greg Rousseau from the Bills. Bills defense looked really good, obviously holding Pittsburgh to 3 points. Offense, Josh Allen didn't play, but didn't put together a whole lot, but still,
I heard
destroyed the way they did.
Well, I heard the recap. I still listen to sports radio in Pittsburgh, so I heard the commentary the next morning, and like the biggest takeaways were they've spent years developing the O-line for the Steelers, spent a lot of money, a lot of draft picks, And to see that basically neither quarterback had any type of protection in any way. Like they went through like the coverages and how it was like 6-on-4 in a lot of these, and like they still weren't able to protect the quarterback for more than like a moment or two. They were just getting hammered from what I heard.
Yeah. I guess the silver lining is, it's preseason and you're glad to see where you can, find weaknesses when it doesn't count, right? Because you know what to focus on for the next week, and then obviously the following week going into the regular season. So we'll see.
Yep.
I don't have anything else in sports for news. The Canadian railway strike is kind of the hot topic. We record middle of the week, so when this releases at the end of the week or whenever you're listening, we'll probably know more about what's going on. But the big takeaway here is if the Canadian railroads go on strike, it will have like ripple effects, especially south of the border into the United States. And the big takeaway was like, there is like, we talk about capacity and truckload and it's very loose and there's an oversupply. But there's not nearly enough to make up for if the railroads go on strike. So you might see a little bit of a short period of tightening until Teamsters get everything worked out with the railroad strike, if that happens. But that's kind of like the hot pressing issue this week. I don't know about anything else.
I had read too, just for some more on that, is I think the shipping lines stopped recently, last week or the week before, accepting import business into the U.S. that needs to go to Canada because they don't know if they can actually get it out of the ports and into Canada. So I know that's already at least occurred. And the other thing I dug into is what are the commodities that actually get on rail and go up through these corridors, right? And again, think railroad versus truck. What I would have expected to see are heavier things, right, that move cheaper and slower on a railroad. Like that's the trade-off usually between truck and rail. And like that's what most of the commodities were. If anyone wants a deep dive into this, check out Jason Miller on LinkedIn. I think he's University of Michigan. He's a professor up there, but he did a really great article on this that he posted. It's mostly like iron ore, lots of different metals.
A lot of like bulk raw materials, right?
Bulk raw materials, really heavy things. And I really should have saved it for the show today. But I mean, there are going to be impacts. It will impact trucking if this occurs for sure. Will likely put upward pressure on rates because even if all of those goods don't still go up by train, it doesn't mean all of them are going to go by truck. They will probably go up by truck in different volumes, different weights at slower paces because you can't put as much on a truck as you can a train. So, I mean, I'm expecting to see some rates shift and some of the carriers grabbing some freight heading up there that wouldn't otherwise, which will shift things in the market and create more opportunities in our industry. So,
yep, that's how it works. All right. Well, we're going to do we got something from Steven here.
Steven, and that's the other good point. The other port strike that we're waiting to hear updates on is the East Coast port strike, which is, I thought it was scheduled like late September, but it is definitely between now and the election. And I don't know what the exact dates are on it, but I mean, there's a lot happening on the international side, and that for sure will affect things domestically, truckload wise.
For sure. You got anything else in news?
No, I was trying to see if I could find that really quick on what he said commodities were, but when I find it, I'll share it later in the show. I'm sure.
All right. Well, we're going to do a little special segment called Let's Talk About Double Brokering, I guess.
Yeah.
So, Ben, take me through what happened yesterday with your load.
So it wasn't my load. It was a client I worked with that reached out for some help. But here was the situation where their customer actually just called and said, hey, needed an update on a load. They called the dispatcher that booked the truck on the load. And when they called the dispatcher for an update, the dispatcher was like,
Was this an independent dispatcher for a trucking company?
This is a dispatcher working for a trucking company. Okay. So like normal scenario, like, hey, like tried to call the driver, no one answered. So your second phone call is just to the dispatcher. Hey, shipper was just looking for an ETA. How's the guy doing? Is he close? Is he there? Right. That dispatcher tells them, hey, I didn't book this load with you. And oh, by the way, somebody hacked our email. We had a freight guard reported a few days ago. Check it out. It's on Care 411. but for sure, that's not us. We didn't book this load with you. It's not on our schedule, and we don't have it. It's the first thing that happened.
That is wild. Okay.
So, and
All right.
again,
So
we talk
stolen
about this,
identity, right?
right?
We've seen this
So
before.
step one was, client calls me, hey, I think we got a double brokered load over here. I'm not really sure what I can do. What are next steps? And I'm like, okay, well, step one is you just try to assess what's happened without freaking anybody out, because you just really don't know. And it's like, okay, well, did someone else pick up the load? Is someone else planning to pick up the load? Is that carrier involved with the fraud? Are they an innocent truck that was booked on the load with another company that defrauded them? There's so many different things that could be happening. If you overreact, it's harder to get information, right? So step one was, hey, take a deep breath. Let's work through this step by step. Let's first contact the shipper and see if anyone has arrived to pick up the load. So they did. What they found out was the load was picked up about 45 or an hour before they found this out, right?
Have you fallen victim to double brokering, cargo theft, or identity theft? QuickScope stands out as the only load-level fraud protection tool available today. Unlike any other solution on the market, QuickScope is deployed post-agreement between shippers or brokers and carriers. Shippers can rest assured that their cargo remains secure. Brokers can confidently confirm the identity of the individuals on site for pickup, and carriers can trust that they'll receive timely payment. Start your free trial with QuickScope today by visiting them online at quickscope.com. That's QUIKSKOPE.com. Blue Book Services is the resource you need if you're transporting fresh produce or lumber. Their online databases contain thousands of companies throughout the produce and lumber industry supply chains. You can easily search their databases to generate new sales leads. Blue Book's credit ratings help you avoid companies with high credit risk, and their team can help resolve disputed loads. To learn more, go to producebluebook.com or lumberbluebook.com and click Join Today.
Now, luckily, that shipper got the driver's name, the MC number, the plate number, and the driver name of who they did load. Okay. So,
which is great because now we know who actually has the load.
Has the freight. So that is huge because oftentimes, and I've worked through a few of these this year with guys that you and I know that we work with, where it took hours to try to find out who actually loaded the truck and who actually got loaded, right? Whether it's looking at security cameras, if they don't write this down, like that is the first hardest step sometimes. So great. Got a carrier name, got an MC. Okay. I said, next step you want to do is reach out to the driver calmly. Do not be accusatory. You don't know if they did anything wrong at all. They might be a victim of fraud as well and just picked up the load and genuinely don't know what's happening.
That's usually what it is, right? They're usually an innocent bystander who just happens to get roped into it.
Exactly. And I'm like, if you freak them out, like you could make this worse. They might not answer the phone. And then Lord knows what's going to happen from that point, right? So call the driver. Driver said, no, I didn't work with you and I didn't book this load with you, and hung up. I'm like, okay, not a great start. I was like, okay, step two, reach out to everybody you can at that company, the MC that actually picked up the load. Call a dispatcher, call the owner, call and make phone calls until you reach somebody, and try to ask questions to understand where this load came from, right? So luckily, we're able to reach a dispatcher, and the dispatcher was like, oh yeah, we booked this load with this brokerage. And I don't want to tell you who this brokerage was, but like they're pretty big. And they were like, yeah, we got a rate con. We got a rate con for, call it 2,500. Well, our client booked the original carrier for like 1,600, let's say, right? So now at least we know that that legitimate carrier doesn't seem like they were involved in the fraud. It seems like they were also a victim, but we also don't know this yet, right?
But pause right there. Look at the numbers alone, right? The rate was too good to be true, right? They're brokering this load for way more money than the actual broker had in it. So that's
correct.
That's a red flag right there. And again, if you're a carrier and you're getting a rate offered to you that seems way too high or way higher than market average, your spidey senses should kick in there.
Right. So next step is, I'm like, okay, ask them to send you all the paperwork. The paperwork and the rate con that the truck that has this load, right, was sent, who they booked it with, have them forward all this information to you, right? And then you can start working through actually what happened. And then The next call is they called me back and said, okay, well, like, what do I do with this carrier that actually has the load? Because they want paid $2,300, right? Or 25, whatever it was, the higher rate. And they're like, I only have this amount in it. What should I do? And I think this is worth pausing on for a moment, because this can go either way. Because the reality is you don't have to pay that carrier what they were offered by the fake company. Because we've seen scenarios like this where they're offered thousands of dollars more. Like it's a $3,000 load and they've been booked for $7,500 and they think they hit the lottery. And criminals know that, because if they do that, then the drivers and the carrier that actually has the load tend to trust the guy who said they'll pay them more, because it's, the green-eyed monster. Oh, we're going to make so much money. They just so much want to believe that they're getting $7,000 for a $3,000 load, that even when they're called by the shipper later, and I've been involved in those, like the driver's like, no, man, I'm getting $7,000. And you're like, well, hey, it's not supposed to deliver in Memphis. It's going to LA. And they're like, no, man, this is what my Raycon says, and I'm getting $7,000. And they literally will continue taking it and then have it stolen, and then they don't get paid at all. Yep. So this is how these sometimes play out. The other is sometimes a double broker tries to steal the funds and actually have the load delivered. Because if they actually want to steal the money and not the freight, the load actually has to be delivered in order for them to get the bill of lading to invoice the company to steal the money for the load. In this case, whatever, $1,700 or $1,600, right? So when we get the information back and they call me back, it looked like they didn't change the delivery address. It didn't look like they were trying to divert it to steal the cargo. And then when we looked at the Raycon, we could see by the email addresses that the broker that booked the real carrier on this, the email was wrong, right? It was so-and-so brokerage.net. And then when I looked in Highway and RMIS, that brokerage's MC are all .coms. So I'm like, okay, well, here's our first point of evidence that this is the impersonation and where it's happening. The second place the first place we found it was the carrier that was originally booked had said, like, someone hacked our email. We know that's true. And there's a few takeaways to both of these, because when we researched this, it was reported on Carrier 411 a few days ago, was not yet on Highway because there is some lag. And RMIS said that person hadn't verified their identity yet. And that process involves literally a photo ID. But there's so many carriers that, like, it's not uncommon to have a legitimate carrier not have their ID verified on RMIS. And it's not uncommon for like a few of these things to look like this. But when you take it all together, you start to get this picture, right? And again, I think the bigger takeaways too is, like, had that broker made their check calls the way we talk about, meaning like before you dispatch the truck, you booked them on the load. You should not be giving them the physical address when you book them on the load. You shouldn't be giving them the pickup number, hence quick scope and why we talk about that. What you should be doing is, in the Raycon should just be the rate, the city and the state, to where the city and state is. And then once you call them back a few hours before the load to verify that driver is empty, you should be asking that driver, hey, wanted to verify your equipment. What are you rolling with? You don't ever say you got a reefer, because everyone says yes. You let them tell you. And then you hear, oh, okay, you got a reefer. Oh, is it, whatever your requirements are. Hey, by the way, what's the color of your truck? What's the MC on the side of it? I got to make sure the shipper knows you're on your way. Most oftentimes, like, they'll tell you the truth because they're a victim too. And in this scenario, that would have caught this. Like, literally that phone call would have prevented this from going any further, right? But it is really a good example as to why simple things and attention to detail. I know we're always busy, and I know, it's hard to keep up with everything, but these are vital. Like, to me, these are like the core responsibilities of a freight broker. We don't own trucks. We don't own these things. We deal in information and communication. And if we're not specific and we don't do that well, we open ourselves to liability in a lot of ways.
So I'm curious, so what was the actual intent? Like, what? So somebody stole a carrier's identity and got the load.
And then
what were they trying? Like, normally with a double broker, they would try to resell the load at a way above market rate with no intent to pay it, but with an intent to take a quick pay or even just a standard pay from the broker who gave it to them. So what was their actual play in this one? I still don't really
We
grasp.
don't know for
Like,
sure
were they just a
because,
bad double broker? Like they're a
well,
bad
that's what I
scammer?
thought at first. I was kind of laughing. I'm like, this is either the worst criminal in the world, or they're just starting their criminal enterprise,
Yeah.
or like we just caught it before they did it. And like my guess is one of two things probably would have happened. The one is what you said. They would have tried to invoice for the load with a POD so that they got paid, and then they wouldn't have paid the real truck. And we would have found out, the client would have found out whatever, like 40 days later, because we've seen this happen a
But they
lot,
were impersonating an actual carrier, so how would they have
Correct.
gotten paid?
That's the thing that doesn't make sense, because I'm like, the client that I was working with, like they use a factoring company to process all their payments. And I'm like, the money wouldn't even have gone to them. It would have went to the company they pretended to be because of the MC and their billing. Like they would have never got that money. The only thing, and like the client called me this morning, I was talking to him right before this. They talked to the real brokerage that was impersonated, right? That had the .net instead of the .com. They got a
Yeah.
hold of them and they were like, hey, we found out about this too. Our DAT login was hacked and we know this was happening. We're trying to figure out what's going on. And then they had said, what they think was happening, and it happened on another one of the situations after they were, fished, was that the load was held hostage for a quick pay to get half the money. And basically, in that scenario, the broker just cut the check for whatever, 2 or 3 grand to make sure the load got delivered. And that's probably what they would have tried to do, is my guess. But again, they caught it, thankfully, soon enough and worked through it to be able to avoid the disaster. But it's a really good learning experience, I think, for everybody out there on why check
That's a
calls
weird
are
one,
not
man.
like, they're there for a reason. It's not just to know where the driver is. It's also to make sure that you know who is who and who's picking up your load. Like that is literally what we're paid to do.
Yeah. Wow. That's a pretty complex one, and I'm still not sure if they're just a bad criminal, like a
Correct.
failed criminal or an inexperienced criminal or what. But just goes back to the whole point of double, triple check everything. Have a good standard operating procedure in place for your organization that covers vetting of carriers prior to using them, as well as the load level verification. So that
I have
could
a
be.
question.
What's that?
So I have a question too.
Yeah.
And this is one I'm looking to get clarification on, because I'm not sure. I'm fairly certain I know the answer to, but I definitely want to check this. In a scenario like that, where a broker books a carrier, thinks they do the due diligence. However, that carrier was impersonated. So they're using their vetting tools, right? But someone gets through, and that still happens, right? If that load, for instance, is taken hostage and they don't pay it, and the load never gets delivered and just disappears, okay, in that scenario, right, does any insurance come into play?
I don't think so. Like stolen cargo, I don't think whose insurance would cover it. Like the customer is whoever owns the freight, which would be in most cases the shipper, unless it's FOB, like we've talked about in other episodes. But I don't think the customer's insurance would cover stolen. I mean, maybe. I guess it depends.
But contingent cargo certainly is not going to come into play.
No,
the only other question,
even a cargo policy is not going to cover.
A cargo policy isn't going to come into play either. The only question I was thinking is there some liability or culpability between the shipper and the freight broker for the broker being defrauded? Like, would errors and omissions insurance come into play in that scenario?
I doubt it, man. Do you remember the situation I gave you about a month ago?
Adidas. That's what I was thinking of.
So, basically, if you didn't hear the episode, we had an instance where someone posed as a brokerage, took a load, gave it to an independent or like an owner operator, changed the BOL to have it delivered to some random warehouse in LA instead of a Costco in Maryland. And we got a hold of the shipper, we got a hold of the receiver, and after a couple of weeks, they verified, it never arrived. So they acknowledged that the goods were stolen, and it was hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of Adidas apparel. And legitimately, they just kind of accepted it as part of cost of doing business, stolen goods, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth. So they weren't going to try and pursue any kind of insurance claim. They weren't trying to pursue any criminal action. They literally were just it never showed up.
Here's another example.
That's
agreed
insane to me.
And I remember that too, because the other thing I was thinking, and again, like there are some other guys that clients that you and I both worked with where this has happened to, and they've been able to recover some of it. But again, I mean, if you're doing a lot of business with a shipper, let's just say this is one of your largest customers, and they end up losing $100,000 because the broker was defrauded. I got to imagine that shipper is probably not going to want to do business with that freight brokerage anymore unless they either pay some of it, maybe all of it, maybe withhold the accounts payable to that brokerage, like in a claim scenario.
In freight, time is money, and efficiency is key. That's where Levity comes in. Imagine automating your email operations to do more with less effort. Levity connects directly to your inboxes, extracting vital information from emails and attachments in real time. It seamlessly integrates with your TMS, empowering you to quote faster, build loads more efficiently, and book more freight in less time. Whether it's incoming emails from shippers or carriers, Levity's got you covered. It understands any language, any format, and even interprets non-standard formatting. Visit levity.ai today to sign up and get started.
Tired of struggling to find accurate rates and the right carriers for your freight? With DAT1, you can access more than 500 million posted loads and trucks every year. That's 3 times more capacity than any other load board. Plus, their integrated freight management system makes it easy to cover loads 24/7. They have the most trusted network of carriers, brokers, and shippers in the country. You'll get real-time rates on every lane so you know exactly how much a shipment will cost before you commit to it. Plus, you get instant access to top bids from qualified carriers around the country. Get 10% off your first year of DAT1 when you visit the link in the show notes. Like, I haven't
you're
seen...
probably losing a customer over this.
Correct.
Yeah.
But here's the next thing then. Do you end up in litigation, I guess, because they're not going to want to pay the money owed, even though these are different scenarios? Like, it's super common for a shipper not to pay their past invoices until a claim's resolved sometimes, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, it's not legal, but they do it. And
It
I'm
happens all
like,
the time. Yeah.
yeah. And I'm like, I feel like this is probably likely what would happen in these scenarios. But if anyone out there has run into this with a large customer of theirs, and the load was stolen, I'd be curious to hear if or how. And I've got calls this afternoon with a few people like Verisk, CargoNet, and I'm really curious to see how and what happens after these things, right?
Yeah. Yep.
From an insurance perspective, what can, does, or won't cover anybody, who, why, and when.
Yeah. Interesting. It reminds me of like article I read, it was like a year ago, but it was basically businesses, whether it's retail or grocery, like they have an expected line item in their budget or their projections for shrinkage, like loss, theft, spoilage, whatever. Like, for example, like self-checkout at grocery stores, they know that either intentionally or by mistake, not everything's getting scanned, right? I remember during the peak of COVID when the grocery chain in my area, Wegmans, they offered this service where you could scan on your phone and basically scan on your phone and load your reusable bag in your cart and then never have to like scan at the checkout. So it's basically honor system. There's no scale waiting for you to scan it and put it down to make sure the weight is there. And they got rid of it after like a year because they're like, yeah, we've had, too much loss. So, but anyway, interesting story. Should we get into supply chain 101, Ben?
Let's jump into it.
So we wanted to have an episode today where we just kind of break down our supply chain at a 40,000 foot view, because for a lot of people that are new to brokerage, you're also very likely new to logistics or supply chain in general. And it's good to get an understanding of where we fall in the big scope of things, right? Because with domestic freight brokerage, we're typically dealing with truckloads of freight being moved from one location to another. But what we don't really think about normally is, well, where did it come from before, right? Where does it go afterward? We could talk about things like warehousing or imports, exports, the sourcing of raw materials, the distribution network, things of that nature. Where do we want to start here?
I think we start at kind of the beginning and walk through it, like where most cargo originates, and kind of work through maybe an example.
Yeah, that sounds good. So obviously, and we've talked about raw material to finished goods in various other bits of content. So your raw material has two options. It either comes from within the United States or it's imported. There's no other options, right? So if it comes from within the United States, it's pretty simple. But let's talk about the importing side of things. So oftentimes, whether it's due to cost or just availability of the product, we're going to, companies will source their materials from outside of the United States. And it doesn't have to be raw material. It could be a partially finished product or components, things of that nature that maybe are made in Asia or they're made in some other part of the world, right? And they're going to come in. Typically, we had a great episode with Sal Mercogliano, who I don't know if you saw it. He was like on national news this week about that little yacht that big yacht that sank off of Italy. We talked about ocean shipping. So your materials typically will come in on a boat into the United States through a port, right? And there's a whole process of, the raw material or those components are produced or sourced, and then they're transported to a port. They're loaded on to a ship, typically in a container. They're shipped across for weeks across the ocean, and they're going to get to a port in the United States, at which point they then have to get offloaded and loaded then onto a truck or onto a rail line or there's a lot of different options here. What do you got?
So let's walk through this too, and how and who's involved, right? So everyone always kind of asks how industries work together, right? So for the overseas piece, right, we do not have a license to move freight outside of North America to Canada and to Mexico because of NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. We can send trucks back and forth.
And you're dating yourself right now. It's the USMCA as of like 7 years ago.
Then
U.S. Canada Mexico agreement. But yeah, okay. NAFTA's a replacement.
Either way, appreciate the clarity. So you can send trucks up to Canada, you can send them into Mexico, right, and vice versa. But in order to move goods internationally, right, across the ocean or anywhere outside of those two examples, right, you need a freight forwarding license, right, or what's called an NVOC, a non-vessel owning common carrier, right? That's the license that I think sits under the FMC, which is the Federal Maritime Commission, and also somehow reports or needs to follow the guidelines of it's not border protection, it's the, and I have this in my other notes. They handle all of the international regulations related to international.
Like commerce?
Transit. No, it's I will find it in 1 second, but I'll circle back to that because I know Steven put this in the notes for a training I did a while ago, and I will have it in 1 second.
Okay. The other thing we didn't mention too is the customs clearance process.
Correct. Now, the customs piece, right, they're typically handled by a customs brokerage. So the overseas piece, usually the freight forwarders are negotiating prices with the vessel owning companies like Maersk, CMA, MSC, right? Because those companies don't typically do business with a few containers. They work with companies that do more volume for obvious reasons. So freight forwarders tend to work with the big vessel owning carriers the same way freight brokers operate with trucking companies. And their license allows them to create bills of lading, to import goods into the United States. That's how that business functions. And as freight forwarders, how they work with freight brokers is they'll quote all the overseas piece. Like, I got a freight forwarder, they do a lot of business in Turkey. So they'll talk to their customers and shippers in Turkey and go, okay, I got 6 containers coming into the US. They'll send it to me and go, here's what's coming in. Can you quote it? Here's the destination. Say it's going to Memphis. They'll go, I'm looking at either bringing this in New Jersey or possibly in Charlotte or in Miami. And they'll ask me to quote the truckload price to pick it up from the port and take it to the destination. They compare each of the truckload rates to the overseas rate. They pick the cheapest. Sometimes they pick the fastest. So they're either looking at price or time the way we do, add those together. They hand and tender me the load. They handle the BOLs. That's how that freight gets handed off. That's how freight brokers assist. We give it to the carriers and manage that to the delivery. We invoice the freight forwarders. The freight forwarders then invoice the customers, usually the beneficial cargo owners. That's how like that international piece tends to function. The only other thing is like they mostly come in containers. Sometimes they come in bulk. Literally, they just literally crane bulk steel or bulk pipe onto different kinds of boats, or they have roll on, roll off, which is literally what it sounds like. There's literally rolling
Ramps.
stock.
Yeah.
Militaries, a very common one. Tractors that were coming into Baltimore when that bridge collapsed. A lot of rolling stock comes in through the Baltimore market, right? That's really how the international piece happens, right? The customs piece, to your point, like freight brokers don't handle customs. In fact, we don't have the notice of assignment or the, what is it? It's the attorney form where power of attorney. That's
Yes.
typically more the international piece because they deal with the customs brokers. Usually, as a freight broker, whoever is shipping this or working with the BCO for the international piece, they just tell us who the customs broker is. They go, here's the customs broker. We tell the trucking company, hey, here's the customs broker for this load. When they get to usually Canada or Mexico, the customs broker just handles that piece of it and then they just keep going. Right. So, up in
Yep.
your experience with any of the stuff coming in and out of.
So the I actually had a situation this morning that was interesting because when you're clearing the border, yes, you have to have customs documentation and the customs clearance process. We had one this morning where one of our guys, in lieu of having a forwarder involved that has that deals with the customs process with a customs broker themselves, one of our guys is dealing directly a um, with a customs broker, and he's preparing the import paperwork and the customs invoice. So I'm no expert in the import export game, but there are certain parts of that process that freight brokers themselves can take on. I would say rule of thumb, leave it to the experts who that's their job when it comes to getting things cleared to come into the country. And there's cost associated with all of this. So, in the example that I dealt with this morning, the broker is going to be paying roughly, and it's going to range, but roughly about $100 a load just to get the customs part cleared. So that's your import side of it. Steven actually had an interesting note, and I'll read it off, but he's talking about tariffs. So I'll read it verbatim, but he said, tariffs will dictate the amount of certain items that can come in from certain regions per year. To avoid tariffs, companies will utilize bonded warehouses in the United States to hold the product and release it at the first of the year. Imported beef is a big one. Brazil and Ireland share a tariff and will have exceeded the limit as of October 1st, and they believe that the total amount for next year is already sitting in bonded warehouses and will be released January 1st, 2025. So if you don't know what bonded means, basically, like we talk about bonded carriers, bonded warehouses. These are basically, to give it a very, very, watered
Broad.
down explanation, they're
Yeah.
secure where they're not subject to customs inspection
And
while
licensed.
while they're in that custody.
And some, right, and I'll find this too, like they have, like he said, like they literally don't get taxed. They basically sit in like what I would call like purgatory. They're like in
Yep.
limbo. They're not really there. They're not where they came from. So they're not taxed yet, which allows these companies to let them sit there, lock in the price of their goods, not pay the taxes because they're not delivered. And they just sit there in limbo until they're ready to take them out. Then they incur the taxing, and basically the transaction just gets a pause. And there's some cost to use those. They're also involved heavily sometimes in fraud. There's a good Billions episode on this where like they do this with paintings where like billionaires literally take $100 million painting, they put them in these, and then they just sit there because they don't actually receive them. They don't have to pay taxes on it yet, but yet they still own it, and they just try to move them around. There's a name for that too, Stephen. If you can look that up, I can't find it in my notes right now, but there's another name for that. And I found the other one too for NVOCCs. So they report to the Federal Maritime Commission, the primary government agency responsible for regulating activities of NVOCCs in the US, right? They have to obtain an Ocean Transportation Intermediary License, an OTI, from the FMC to operate legally. The FMC also requires NVOCCs to provide proof of financial responsibility, like a surety bond. Because if they break these, it's not like in our industry, you get a $10,000 fine, no one enforces. They're much higher fines. If I remember, they were like 75 grand or higher, right, of violations. The other thing was the CBP, U.S. Customs and Border Protection. While the CBP does not directly license NVOCCs, they play a significant role in the import-export process because the NVOCCs have to comply with the CBP regulations and ensure that all shipments meet the necessary customs requirements.
Interesting.
That was a lot, but
yeah. No, that's good. That's some good knowledge right there, though. We don't think this is the stuff we don't think about, but if you are like, I know we were talking supply chain 101, but if you're a freight broker, there is an entire market of customers that are just the freight forwarding industry, right? These are the companies that a lot of times deal with importing goods, and they have their own customers. So, for example, the Adidas shipment that we talked about earlier, the actual shipper was a freight forwarder. It wasn't Adidas. It was a freight forwarder whose customer was Adidas, and they were the ones that brought their goods in because Adidas manufactures their stuff overseas. They had it sourced from overseas. It was brought in. The freight forwarder had it in their warehouse, which is where it was shipping out of, to go to the Costco in Maryland. All right, so that's your import part. And actually, the example I just gave kind of touched on a bunch of different parts of the supply chain, which is like the warehousing, the distribution of all of it. And what's really cool about this, and we won't get too thick in the weeds about it, is every step of this process, once it's in the States, is an opportunity for a freight broker to be involved, right? So how did it get from the Adidas example? How did it get from I'm guessing it probably came in like the port of LA or Long Beach. How did it get from there to a warehouse in Tucson or Phoenix, Arizona? A freight forwarder could easily be involved in that, right?
Yep.
Whether that's there's drayage involved there, or just a truckload, or it could be rail that it was taken there,
or air.
It's
just not ocean,
probably
right? Like things come in by boat and plane, right? So like if you're picking up product from an airport, it's likely tendered by a freight forwarder, not the beneficial cargo owner.
For sure. And then the distribution. So I remember taking a logistics class in college, or a supply chain class, and it was really cool to see on a map. I think it showed like basically the was it spoke and hub concept? Is that what it's called? Mm-hmm. Where like, Amazon does like a really good job at this on a like micro level, but basically to reduce the amount of transit time that goods have to go through, or transit distance that goods have to go through to get to their destination, organization like distributors, manufacturers, whatever, they will set up distribution centers throughout the country that service a general area.
LTL is a great example.
What's that?
LTL is a great example of that too.
LTL is a great example of how it works, where basically you've got service centers all over the country, and they're going to service a local, we'll just call it a radius around that location. And then they'll move it across their network to get to the destination service center, which then will, get it delivered. But distribution centers, or DCs as we call them for short, tend to be regionally based. We'll just call them like giant warehouses stocked with goods, right? And the purpose of that is, if I need to get, let's say I have, beer's a great example, right? We'll use beer. So if I want to get my beer that's normally made in California, if I want to get it on the shelves in the Northeast or in Florida, that's a really far distance from California. So what can they do? They can either produce all of it in California and then ship it out to distribution centers on the East Coast, or they might pop up a contract brewing organization or location on the East Coast that'll make it and then store it in a East Coast distribution center, which can then get it on the shelves in different locations. I wanted
to pick up on what you said too, right? I think for anyone else listening out there, like, and I know we're trying to cover a lot, and maybe we make this a 2-part episode, because like, as I'm thinking too, right? Like, I think it's helpful for everyone out there to think about this too, right? So anytime you buy something, if you've heard drop shipping in the past few years, those businesses popped up and were really popular, right? Anytime you've ordered something from Instagram or something and you watch it track, you'll see it. You'll see it move really quick and then stop somewhere for like a day or two. Then it'll move very quickly across the country, and then it'll stop. Like, I live in South Florida. So like, I remembered I ordered a surfboard, for example, right? You could see it literally in California. You could see it sit there. and then it moved like a few hundred miles, and then it sat there for like 2 days. Like it's on LTL because it sat in that distribution center. Then all of a sudden it moved very quickly, like a truck, literally about 550 miles a day, all the way to northern Florida, like Gainesville, for example, right? Then it sat there for 2 days. Then as soon as it left there, it moved very quickly and was delivered to my house within like literally the drive time from here to Gainesville, right? This is exactly what we're talking about. That product came from a distribution center, moved to another one. They waited till they had enough product that needed to go to northern Florida, filled up a truck, sent it to Gainesville. Then they waited until they had enough to probably fill like a box truck, a smaller truck that needed to go to South Florida. Once they had enough, then they shipped all of that product at one time so it's more efficient and cheaper to save on shipping, to make my surfboard actually reasonably priced. Then it gets to me, right? That's why it's very unpredictable from a timing standpoint when you use them, but it is effective from a cost perspective. We talk about cost versus time a lot as a freight broker. This is an example where you see that in a network like LTL, right? But it also happens larger scales where companies do this with full truckloads as well.
Yeah, and I want to, being a one-on-one topic here, I want to kind of break down really quick the LTL versus full truckload versus partial, just to kind of clarify that. So LTL is less than truckload. So we're talking maybe a single pallet or 3 pallets or something like that. And what an LTL motor carrier will do is they will take pallets of goods, or just, it could be, doesn't have to be a pallet, it could be barrels of some kind of chemical, but they'll take, I'll just say, pallets of goods from multiple customers, consolidate them, put them on a truck, and move them in a certain direction. That's the whole goal there is you're not using a dedicated truck and spending the money for a dedicated truck. You're sharing space with other shippers or customers on a shared trailer. Whereas full truckload, you're filling up the entire truck with one customer's freight. Then there's partial, which is somewhat of a hybrid in between, where maybe I'm going to use part of a truckload and share, half of it with somebody else, versus LTL, where you might have 20 different shipments on one truck or on one trailer.
So I want to pause there because this is a great prospecting topic and strategy. What I did very early on in my career, when it was really still hard to get customers, to get trust, and to find opportunities to move freight, right? It is working between those three things and asking questions to determine what the customer really should be doing, because sometimes they don't understand the correlation between price and time and service, right? So for instance, let's say you have 2 pallets that need shipped from Miami to Oregon, right? To Portland, Oregon, right? Okay, if those 2 pallets don't need to be there by any certain time because they don't expire, they're not perishable, and they literally aren't needed in any short time window. If they get there in the next week or two, like everybody's okay, they care more about price. Usually LTL is the better way to move that. Now let's go one step further. Let's say you really do need it there reasonably fast. You want some control and visibility into it moving, but you don't really want to go full truckload because it's 2 pallets. Now, if you understand this and they go, hey, look, this load needs to pick up today. It's the 21st. I need it there really probably in like 5 to 6 days. And I know that's about the transit time, but I don't want to pay for a dedicated truckload. I don't want to pay for 40,000 pounds worth of space, or 53 feet of space, because I only need 2 pallets and I don't need to pay for the whole truck. So now the step above LTL is a partial option where you're going to look at, and you price this basically, what would it cost to do a whole truckload? And then take that number and divide out the space in the truck you're using to give you a starting point. You still got to post these loads up to get an idea if there's enough trucks that run partials from here to there, would be willing to, and what they would charge. Because some lanes, there's lots of partial trucks that do this a lot, and you get a decent rate because there's a lot of them. Some lanes, there's almost no trucks going there. So getting a partial option in itself is very hard, and you might not even be able to do it. If you're shipping from the middle of nowhere to the middle of nowhere, you literally might not be able to find a truck willing to partial their space out. So there's no perfect way to price those. You really do have to post them and kind of do this to get some experience.
It totally depends on a ton of other factors.
Yes. And where how you post them,
to go, how much space they have available, etc.
And the timing. So you need to post these and put in the comments the weight, the size, the dimensions, and DAT will allow you to do this. Carriers know this is a partial load when you say that, but put it in the comments, partial load, right? And then you'll get different phone calls and you'll get different pricing, right? And then the one step above that is dedicated. Hey, this has to get from here to there. It has to deliver on this time. I can't have this truck stopping anywhere to pick up anything along the way. Now you're at full truckload, even though it's 2 pallets.
Or you could do like a box truck, straight truck, Sprinter van,
Correct.
something like that as an alternative option if you can source one.
You can. And I would say, though, that what we've seen recently in the market is a box truck isn't typically much cheaper than a full truckload. Like most box trucks are running close to $2 a mile, which in some lanes you can get a full truckload. And a different market, there's usually a disparity between the two, to your point, where you get it cheaper running on a box truck. But you still can, and that still could save you some money because they're smaller carriers. They need the work. Sometimes you'll get a better rate, right? And then the other question you want to ask is, okay, do you mind if your cargo is loaded with other cargo? There is some cargo that they want only loaded with their cargo for a number of reasons, right? It could be kosher food, for example. It could be an expensive piece of equipment that they don't want anything else near it. And they don't want their cargo at another pickup and delivery with the door open for anyone to see it because it's maybe high theft, because it's high value.
Don't break the seal, right?
Right. So these are questions to help really get your customer to understand you know your job and industry, and you can provide more than one option to get something from point A to B. But this is the caveat: if you ask the right questions. Hey, tell me about this shipment. Tell me what's important to you. Is it being there on time? Do you have flexibility on delivery date? Do you mind it being loaded with other cargo? Do you have some flexibility on the service or the time? If they don't care about any of those, again, maybe you're at LTO and you can get it cheaper. Maybe all of these things or some are important and they fall in between. But in order to effectively be a good freight broker, you need to be communicating with your customer by asking them questions, not just telling them what they should be doing. This is going to help them learn and also help them learn that you really do know how to do the job that you're asking them to hire you for.
Yep. So all that to say, we kind of bounced around a lot in this episode, but there's opportunity out there in all these different sectors. So we kind of gave you a little bit of insight into the import process, some discussion on distribution, modes of transportation, things like that. But there's opportunity from imported goods at the ports. Your customer could be a distribution center, a freight forwarder. It could be a retailer. It could be a supplier of a certain product. It could be a raw material, someone who sources raw materials. It could be an end product, a fully produced end product that has to get to, the end user. So it's a very, very broad landscape as far as, the reach of our industry, but that's a little 101 talk on supply chain. We could definitely do a multi-part series to break down the different parts of it, because we kind of hopped around quite a bit there, but hopefully you learned something new. I definitely did.
Sure. I think there were definitely a lot of takeaways that we were able to cover. I think maybe if we do a part 2, like we can talk a little bit more about rail, a little bit more on how you choose intermodal versus full truckload. We talked about partials, LTLs versus, dedicated, and a little bit about international. But these are all different options you really have available to you as a freight broker to utilize, to offer to your customers. We have so many different options in our tool belt to be able to help and assist. That's where freight brokers add their value. It's not just doing what a trucking company does. Again, this is the thing that gets me the most, is that like I see this from trucking company owners. They're like, oh, I can do freight brokerage. I'll just get my brokerage license, tell my customers to send me loads, and they'll just do that. Like, we don't offer the same service, and we offer more of them. Our flexibility and understanding of these options is how you provide value and how you differentiate yourself as a broker. Because if you're just talking about trucks, you're missing a whole lot of opportunities to be able to expand your relationship with your customers and do more business together.
For sure. Now, the reality is the full truckload is where a lot of brokers start, but just don't limit your options to just that. So, well, good discussion. Any final thoughts?
Whether you believe you can or believe you can't, you're right.
And until next time, go Bills. That wraps up this episode of Freight 360. Check out the show notes for links to anything that we've referenced on this episode. And make sure to visit us online at freight360.net to see our entire library of episodes, videos, blogs, and more.
And make sure to check us out on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel for daily and weekly tips and content. And if you'd like your question answered on the show, fill out the Contact Us form on our site, and we'll see you next week.